Hello, and welcome to today's SEI webcast, Ransomware, Defense and Resilience Strategy. Our webcast today highlights Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is October. My name is Shane McGraw, Outreach Team Lead here at the Software Engineering Institute, and I'd like to thank you for attending. We want to make today's webcast as interactive as possible, so we will address questions throughout today's talk and again at the end of the webcast. So you can submit your questions now in the YouTube chat area, and we'll get to as many as we can. Our featured speaker today is Brett Tucker. And Brett is the technical manager of the Cyber Risk Management Group within our Cyber Risk and Resilience Assurance Directorate here at the SEI. He also teaches executive and graduate level courses as a CERT adjunct professor at CMU's Hines College and serves as a technical sponsor of the Executive Chief Risk Officer Training Program. Brett, good afternoon. Welcome and looking forward to the discussion today. All yours.
Thanks, Shane. I appreciate it. Holy cow, Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So it's an honor to be able to talk to everybody out there in TV land on this critical topic for such a very relevant month for all of us. We should have Cybersecurity Awareness Year, no offense. But anyway, today I have some exciting things to talk about. I want to share my journey with you. Over the past year or so, worked with a close customer at DHS to develop a ransomware assessment. And I'm very excited to share with you some of the thoughts related to a little bit of the background, but the goals and objectives and how we went about setting those. Kind of talk through like some of the sources or resources available that we thought were nice to tap. And as we go through that journey too, talk about the methodology a little bit and end up talking about not only how we score it, but also some pilots and some lessons learned from this overall effort. Really exciting stuff. So let's just get into it. And I look forward to fielding any questions anybody has as we go through this discussion. So Shane, thank you for keeping watch for me there. So I don't think I really need to spend much time on this slide actually to establish like that burning platform as to why we need this product. I mean, even in recent time, and as you can see from the Acronis report from 2021, ransomware is $1 billion business, and it is getting bigger. There's nothing, it's not shrinking on us, unfortunately. And it's crazy to think that a lot of the common attack vectors are nothing more than just people exploiting stolen credentials, and scary enough, like still individuals and organizations who are opening up phishing emails and just clicking on links and things like that. So basic cyber hygienic kind of practices that we're seeing. So we recognize that there are additional controls, additional considerations for how we identify how these risks get into our organization. So we thought about, okay, so how are we going to assess an organization to understand that susceptibility, right? So what can we do about it? We knew, and we still know, there are tons of great frameworks and standards out there, and I'm going to get into some of those that I can just rattle off to you, and everybody is aware of them. The idea there, the big takeaway, you're going to need a bit of everything, right? We also knew that the tactics, the techniques of these threat actors, they're always evolving. So we need something that not only captures the base blocking and tackling of cyber hygiene and the elements I talked about, but also to think beyond the walls of your own organization, think about third-party providers and start getting into the mindset of how can we be more novel and thinking about how we're going to address this ransomware threat. And most importantly, like what can we give people out of this? If we're going to look at your organization and quantify and measure susceptibility, which by the way is somewhat of a heavy lift, and that's going to be another part of the discussion here as I'm kind of leading you into this intro here. When you put an organization through that, like what are they going to get out of it? What's the return on risk investment? So how are we going to know what controls to put in place? How are we going to know to prioritize them? So I'm excited to bring you these thoughts with that burning platform. Hopefully you feel that discomfort that I feel when we start talking about this stuff. Okay, so let's kind of get to the idea of what we're trying to achieve, right? I mean, you don't want to address any of this assessment business without going in eyes wide open into what you want to accomplish, because this is not easy. It's something that's going to take some time off your hands. One is, you want to be quantifiable. We can qualify that, yes, ransomware is bad. It's a red thing. It's going to slow down our organization. But we really want to get to how your organization feels pain. And by the way, I want to give you two lenses that we're going to look through here. One is the lens of getting ahead of the ransomware event. In other words, seeing that it's going to happen. What are things that we can do to limit those vectors from actually getting within our walls and impacting our organization? But then there's also that cold, dark day where that risk is going to come to fruition. What kind of controls do you have in place? What are the actions that your organization will take to alleviate yourself of that problem? So there's a two-pronged attack that we're looking at here. In that regard, we know that we are going to have to do more than just like some superficial reconnaissance of your organization, where this is more than just looking at scanning for open ports in a sense. We want to really get to the heart of the practices of an organization and identify those risks. We will look at those impacts. Like I said, we want to know your critical services in your organization, and we want to help you understand, okay, so where do you feel that pain? And when that CIA, that confidentiality, that integrity, that availability is disrupted, what about that makes your organization feel the most pain? Because that's going to come front and center and bring that prioritization piece like to bear as we go through the analysis for you. We also recognize, once again, you want to walk away with something. So we're going to have to recommend some mitigations to put in place. And you're going to see that come about when I start talking about the domains that we assess here in terms of what controls may be available to you as we identify gaps or susceptibility in the organization. We know too that when we're doing something like this, that this is a never-ending journey, right? Like all things in risk management, there's an iterative life cycle. So any kind of assessment development or any kind of consideration for assessing or looking at an organization for how it can be improved, it never ends. It's going to be iterative. We know that the development of this assessment is going to be iterative. It's going to always be improving as these tactics, these techniques improve. We need to keep our mind to the methodology improving as well. We know too that there's a lot of great things in place. Like, don't say that like you're not doing anything. I'm sure everybody is at least doing something in your organization, whether it's just the inherent controls that you have when you buy an asset, like all computers you buy these days, they pretty much have a firewall implemented pretty much, things like that. Take credit for where credit is due, but also understand that it's not necessarily enough. And we took that into account as well. Another thing that we greatly value when we do some assessment development is we really try to think about ways that we can pilot these new things. We don't necessarily just want to put it on the street and hope that organizations just adopt it. We want to test it. We want to make sure it's tried and true, and that there really is a value return for you investing your time, money in pursuing such an effort. The good news as you go down this path is you're not alone, right? There's tons of standards and frameworks out there. The ones that we found most appealing as we were pulling together this particular assessment was with CISA Cyber Essentials, MITRE attack framework, and we even started reaching out beyond those qualities that we found in those particular resources, and we started thinking about, okay, so what about third-party providers? We started thinking about cloud, and maybe what the Cloud Security Alliance could bring to bear with its STAR model. So there's some things that we thought about. It's not mama soup. It's not that everything is in there. But what we wanted to do was to be as comprehensive as possible in what we're considering. I want to give some shout outs to some other documents. I didn't have nearly enough room to put on this slide of things that we consider, right? ISO 27000, clearly they have some thoughts here. NIST, I would be remiss without giving them credit. The 800 series was especially helpful there. We looked broadly at enterprise risk considerations, so ISO 31000, and then there's a host of other, COSA enterprise risk framework, things like that, that we were able to look at. And finally, and I'm going to hit upon here, the CERT resilience management model, and a couple slides to show you how that may also bring to bear some thoughts on what domains or areas you want to look at with this assessment. One last thing before I leave this discussion, when I'm talking about consideration of resources, frameworks, standards, models, as you're going about considering establishing any kind of policy or procedure or framework for your organization in terms of addressing risk, you're going to want the best athlete of any and all these standards. There are great ideas in all these standards. You can't use them all. There may be even some conflict in terms of prioritization or the way they do business, right? So what I would recommend is find that one resource, that one framework that your organization hinges upon, maybe your niche shop, something to that effect. but don't dismiss the fact that there are other actors out there, and make it the best of your contextual perspective in terms of building your cybersecurity stack out. So the more diverse the resources that you use, the better that you're going to have like focus in those areas, like the Cloud Security Alliance idea, right? Maybe not even thought about worrying about ransomware coming through that particular vector. So give it all a look, okay? Now, the assessment itself may come out and be the same for just about every organization. We're going to ask about the same questions, right? But clearly the solutions are not necessarily going to be the same. So what I'm saying there is you may have to go back to the books, go back to these standards and frameworks, go back to the root and find out what the recommendations are in terms of controls to be putting in place, and how you may better make risk-informed decisions selecting those controls. There's a lot of other help to be had out there too. Once again, as an organization that's just kind of on the streets, they're trusted advisors, whether it's ourselves, FFRDC, excuse me, they're ISACs, and there's also consulting firms out there. Everybody is willing to help, right? Depends on how much money you have. I'm sure time is a resource too, but it can be helpful. Cyber insurance providers tend to be very helpful with this as well. Not only pre-event, right, to understand what your risk exposure is in terms of procuring your insurance, things like that, but there are a lot now that are providing a lot of additional services in terms of post-event or actually even during the event recommendations as to how to proceed if you find yourself in that cold, dark day, as I was saying. The other thing too that you may want to consider, there are other assessments on the street. And actually, Shane, can you put up for everybody in the chat window? There's, as an example here, there's the DHS CRR, Cyber Resilience Review. Now, it's not going to be pointing directly at ransomware, right? It's actually measuring more of the resilience of your organization, the ability of your organization to bounce back from some kind of major disruption, okay? What I'm saying, though, is at least get that down as a base map of understanding for how your organization, where it stands, where it stacks up in terms of having that element of resilience, okay?
So Brett, real quick, that did lead to our first question from Gail asking, on your first slide, you had a white paper that was listed. What was that white paper again? Was that on the CRR site or the CISA site?
Yeah, there was this real cool report I found. It's called the Acronis report, and it was talking about ransomware events, and it gave some of these metrics. Now, there was some broad discussion in there about cloud protections, things like that. I recommend it. We in the chat window as well. Right. I can provide that to you offline there.
Okay.
So you can have it.
Great.
Yeah. Great question, by the way. Yeah, it's a cool resource. So let's pause real quick and talk about that CERT RMM piece, because if you get into my head and you start thinking, at least the way I think about how we slice and dice an organization, it may help you think a little bit more about how you would decompose the elements of what you want to assess in your organization. So let's start at the highest level, right? We want to think about like, what are the primary strategies of your organization? What are the primary goals and objectives that you're trying to accomplish? Those quickly can be decomposed into your critical services. So suppose you're a manufacturing organization, or you're in critical infrastructure. Maybe you're in the power sector, right? And your strategy is we're going to, obviously we're going to support our market. We're going to bring in so much revenue, but we're going to provide power to our customers, right? If we bring that down to the next level, our critical service is power delivery. Now, what that is built upon are a large series of different processes. There are engineering processes at play, there are administrative processes. We can decompose each of those into high value assets, right? That's literally the people, the information, the technology, the facilities, and even the third-party providers that are helping deliver on that process. And it all integrates together back up to that high level delivery of that critical service. Now, that said, I can easily go in and deprecate or break literally any one of those high value assets. So what I'm giving you here is a mental model of how to decompose your organization and look at what those high value assets are, because a big part of this discussion is going to come down to building a scope for your assessment. Okay, so I wanted to leave this here, and actually same for this particular slide too. Why don't you throw at them the link for the CERT RMM in case they want to go read more about that as well. where this is discussed to greater length too.
That is that as well, Brett. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so now that we've gotten through the intro part, right? Let's talk a little bit about like how you want to break up this assessment. What are the things that you want to think about when you're trying to slice and dice your organization and build out like what are some critical questions to ask? So I like to start with the cold dark day. I don't know, maybe I'm kind of pessimistic like that. With all risk, and a classic for a risk manager, right? Especially with cyber, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So I always like start to think about, well, what's that cold dark day look like and how do I back my way out of it? So that's why you see business continuity, disaster recovery here. These are not in preferential order. So it could easily have been configuration management as the first alphabetic. Well, actually alphabetically, I guess it would have been business continuity, huh? Anyway, so for BCDR, we wanted to look at, and there's a lot of detailed discussion around backup strategies. We also look at incident response practices and not only how those programs and processes are put together, but we really wanted to get a real close look at how those systems are tested, right? How do we think about tabletop exercises versus running full-blown, full-scale exercises that span the scope of the organization? So those are things that we look at. And the real interesting factor here is, obviously, we have organizations that are doing those things, but do they have the right scenarios developed for ransomware? Let's go back to the heart of the discussion. We were talking about ransomware assessment, right? So to make this assessment more focused, to put that sharp point on it, we were talking about, suppose you have a ransomware threat or a threat actor that has gone into the system and has denied you of all availability of your critical high value assets. Let's say it's the information that fuels your enterprise. It's critical services, whatever the case may be. How are you going to respond and how are you going to get back up on your feet quickly? That's a big part of the BCDR. We also want to look at what are you allowing on your networks? What are you allowing on your system, right? So what are on your allow block list? Do you even have them? Are you leveraging them? How often are you updating them? How do you keep them updated? How do you mandate that policy throughout your organization? Are your baselines reviewed and how often? What are your permission restrictions? And do you limit your organization to what they can actually put in their system? And what permissions are provided? So we do a lot with configuration management. Endpoint protection. This gets down to a lot of once again, maybe some cyber hygiene in terms of your antivirus, anti-malware type stuff. But we also start thinking about your prevention of, you're preventing threat actors from getting in your network. So you have IDS, IPS considerations. What kind of web content are we allowed to have let our employees or third-party providers explore? Also want to think about IDAM, your identity access management. Start thinking of things like multi-factor authentication, how your roles for access are provisioned in your organization. We want to understand if your management team is following the conditions for least privilege and how that's being enforced. Is there any kind of policies regarding password management and privileged accounts and how those are provisioned as well? Incident management is another big one. Now, by the way, I see up here that we had incident response. We actually want to think a little bit more now about how incidents are managed. So we're not only talking about in those cold, deep, dark days, what's that program look like holistically? I'll give you an example here. What kind of reporting are you going to be doing? How is it that when an incident goes down, how is it escalated properly across the organization? A lot of organizations struggle right off the bat with knowing what is a tripwire or what are the true key risk indicators that people would know to actually send up the bubble or send up the ball, if you will, that we have an incident, declare it, and call the right people and bring them in. So what does that program management aspect look like? Is there a consideration for risk appetite? How does that all come together? We start looking also at network protections. We start looking at remote desktop protocols, things like that. And by the way, interesting enough, this has really become an issue since COVID, right? We have a lot of people who are at home now. And they may not necessarily, and this comes back to, it's not always a technological solution, it's a cultural one. People are not necessarily coming into work all the time. They're not looking at splash screens that say, hey, make sure you're doing the right thing in terms of password protection and security. Make sure you're not opening up that phishing email, things like that. People get rusty with that at times. And if they're not steeped in that culture, they may be losing it as they're sitting at home. So some things to think about there, especially in that risk management category. But anyway, come back to network protection. How is email being managed? That not only includes the idea of maybe opening emails in sandboxes, things like that, but it may also include the administrative policies you have in place for how people are actually expected to behave in use of their email accounts, right? Network segmentation, a biggie. We know, once again, that cold dark day will come. How far will that threat actor be able to get across your network? It's a critical consideration. You want to think about how you have your network broken up, and what are the roles and what are the practices involved with people being able to navigate your network. Zero trust comes to mind. It's a big issue these days, and it will keep growing. Risk management. When you are building assessments, and we think about ransomware, we think about many others, you're going to want to have, in a sense, a catch-all category. And I don't want to say that risk management is a catch-all category, but it's definitely one of those categories that I find that comes up in a lot of assessments, regardless of whether we're assessing your zero trust practices, your AI ML capabilities of your organization, your ability to address ransomware. We're always talking about risk management. And it extends beyond that technical layer. We've talked a lot about these domains so far. They seem very technical in nature, but don't forget, you have administrative controls, you have physical controls in your organization as well. You need to take credit for those. And you also need to think about risk globally in your organization. Remember that cyber is that silver thread that comes through a lot of needles in your organization. Everybody's walking around typically with a laptop or a cell phone, or a means by which actually your organization could come to a screeching halt in terms of having a threat vector or a way for a threat to get into your organization. So in that regard, risk management is big because it helps the assessor, it helps your organization think globally about your organization and not just about any one risk. Okay, so we're going to talk about insurance practices here. We're going to talk about users, how often they train, what kind of skills they expect to bring to the table in terms of maybe your incident responders. We may also talk about enterprise risk. What's the appetite in the organization? And once again, this ties back to the idea of maybe the incident management piece. And you're starting to think about, what were those tripwires? How do my people know when to declare an incident? Aha. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to remind myself that we need to think of these domains as not just behaving as their own individual domains that you're going to put question sets under. There's a strong Venn diagram between each of these, right? There's a lot of overlap in all these categories. And don't be bashful about having questions that are in one domain and you find yourself asking them yet again in another, because with these assessments, with technical exchanges, when you're starting to talk to people in an organization who are maybe your network architects or engineers versus people who are on your incident response team, they have a different perspective. They have a different awareness and knowledge of how they're using tools, how they're analyzing information. So don't be bashful when you think about asking questions. You're like, did I ask this already of this organization? Your instincts are correct that you may have to ask it again. Okay. Finally, vulnerability management, understanding where those critical gaps are in the network, like where are the most critical points that can be exploited in your organization? How can they be taken advantage of? Okay, so let's talk about the logistics piece of this. And, I really like this presentation. Shane, I really appreciate that you brought me out today to talk about this, because this audience is actually getting more than just a ransomware discussion. They're also learning about thoughts behind how you would develop or think about assessing an organization to find out like its most critical gaps or its biggest risks. Ransomware, just one way to think about it, right? So when I talk about this, the logistics of an assessment, these are some elements that you want to consider for any given assessment or audit that you may have, right? For example, and this is a big one right off the bat, but it's the who's going to come to the table, right? you could easily spend a day waiting for the right person to walk into the room and give you the answer that you're looking for. So from the assessor side of the organization, make sure you have a strong tech lead who understands all the domains, or at least has a good handle of it, or they know who to call if they have questions about that. They understand the question sets, they understand how the assessment's being run. What subject matter experts, though, do they know to bring to the table, right? Are they bringing the incident responders? Are they bringing network architects? Or do they need to just talk to the CISO or the chief risk officer? What level or tier of the organization is a real critical question in terms of who you're going to talk to and what questions you're going to ask them, right? There may be pitch discussions in some of this. So I would always recommend to have someone who is a note taker, someone who, and by the way, that note taker, not necessarily an administrative person, maybe it's a very technical person. So they know what they're writing down. So they write characterization of what's being said. They know when they hear something that they're like your second guess or your second check to say, hey, did you say Microsoft Defender or did you say Defender practices, that kind of thing, right? So there's different ways to think about how you would staff it up. Let's talk about the preparation here. It's not just bringing the right people to the table, but it's also bringing the right information to the table, okay? There's always going to be these initial meetings where you're kind of feeling out the organization. And I want to stop and pause here to use a big word on you, scope. Scope definition is huge in one of these things, in any assessment, but ransomware especially. And I'll tell you why. A lesson learned here is that ransomware is one of those threats that tends to extend itself across many different elements of the organization. Just about every employee could, in a sense, come in contact with this ransomware threat, right? So they have to have some level and degree of education on what to do in that cold, dark day themselves. That goes to speak to like overall organizational policy, user policies, enterprise risk practices, risk awareness for the organization. It's so extensive that you're going to want to think about, well, how is it that we scope our assessment initially? So that way we're talking to the right people and we know the kind of answers we're getting are actually going to get us an understanding of what are the gaps in the organization. You may talk to just an average user who's just walking through the halls and ask them what they know about ransomware just to get that simple sense for what the culture may feel like. Now, by the way, it's one person. I get it. It's at one point. You don't necessarily do that. But a survey may be called for in that regard. That said, some organizations in these initial meetings will tell you what level and degree of comfort they're willing to engage with you in terms of having themselves assessed. Maybe it's your own organization, by the way. I'm not just talking about an external party coming in. Maybe you represent your CISO shop and you need to reach out to your own internal organization. There still may be, internal barriers, culturally speaking, or maybe people just don't understand and they don't want to talk to you for that reason. These initial meetings are to socialize what you're looking for, to identify what scope you're going to be talking about, and to put exact dates down on when you're going to have that kickoff meeting, when you're going to start talking to people and having that technical exchange, okay? So let's go to that. There's that upfront initial part, and then there's the execution part, which we're entering into, where you're going to start actually sitting down with these experts, right? And typically we find that a 1 to 2 day engagement is optimal for most assessments. Clearly, you could always want more, right? And the reason why I say it's optimal is because most organizations tend to lose momentum with you after that time. Like they have jobs, they have things that they need to get done. So to sit with any kind of assessment team or any kind of auditor for any longer than that, it's going to start getting painful. And you're going to tell as an assessor, as a seasoned assessor, you're going to start hearing people giving short one-word answers instead of like the extensive, like, oh yeah, and this is how it works and this is why. So anyway, you want to try and design any given assessment to that. And clearly not always possible, right? For bigger organizations, they're especially large, you're going to struggle to try and get all questions in to get all players to the table within those 2 days. That's fine. Don't feel like it has to be compressed into the same 1 to 2 days. Maybe it's broken out over a week or so. Now, be cautious once again, as that gets strung out more and more, it's going to be more and more forgotten about. People are going to be harder to get a hold of. And the ultimate customer, the senior executives who are looking for the results of this assessment are going to get frustrated. They're like, look, we let you into the door, like, we let you do this assessment, like, when are we going to get answers here? And you're like, oh, we're still looking for those last 1 or 2 people to talk to. Anyway, okay. So we would assume that maybe there's 1 to 2 days. And if you're having trouble fitting that, you got to go back and revisit that scope question. Are you looking at the right system? Or maybe you have to look at yet a smaller subset. Don't feel bad if you have to extend beyond that initial scope of that one system that you're looking at to ask more enterprise-driven questions so you can get an overall understanding of the culture. But then you could always bring it back down and start speaking technologically about that one system. And then you make extrapolations of, okay, so if this is a practice for one system, is this the same for others? Okay, clearly there's going to be this analysis here. I'm going to talk about this in the latter slide, but I just wanted to talk about the overall logistics of the effort in terms of how long this is going to take. When people say to me, Brett, like, come assess me, how long is it going to take? You have to consider how long it's going to take your facilitators and your analysts to kind of look at this information, to understand and identify the risks, to work with the team that was assessed to go back and clarify if there are any additional questions, anything like that. That could take some healthy bit of time. 10 to 15 working days is not unusual, especially if you have an organization that tends to be bureaucratic or has multiple layers in it that you're going to want to vet these results with and understand what their concerns are. So you may be talking at the end of the day, maybe a good month or more of manpower to make this happen. Okay, so a little bit about the scoring and attack vectors. When we did the ransomware idea, we wanted to consider some common attack vectors. And at the very beginning, the very first slide or so, I mentioned phishing. So clearly that was a big one and probably one of the more primary focuses of this, but we wanted to go beyond that. So if we had consideration for any public facing applications or any things that were enabled on the web, this is especially big for organizations that have like service sites or anything like that that customer base needs to visit, how those can be exploited. Talk about credentials and how they're managed in an organization, because stolen credentials is a big factor. And we also wanted to talk about, okay, so after the ransomware actually gets in the organization, talk to us about like the types of encryption that may be used, and how, in fact, if that information is encrypted, that your critical information, how would you be impacted in terms of your operations? So we looked at several different ways we could consider this threat of ransomware. Going back to those domains, we had specific questions related to practices around the controls within those domains. And you're going to quickly find that everybody has their own version of the truth, right? In some cases, they have controls that are fully implemented. In other words, they're up and they're implemented such that the configuration is optimized, that's maintained well, patched regularly, things like that. But you may find that maybe as a generally accepted matter that patches are not taking place regularly. Maybe it's on a, I don't know, semi-annual basis or something to that effect. If that's the case, they're doing some goodness, but not nearly with the great effect that they could have if they were doing things more often, or if they were doing it in terms of maybe accepted practice you may find in NIST SP 153 or something to that effect. Anyway, we would say that that's a partially implemented example. And then you have the case where just nothing's happening, so it's not implemented. Now, the cool thing is for the fully, partially, and non-implemented, you can put a logical scale of scoring here to help assist you in understanding, like, overall, I can give you an index, or think of it as like a speedometer, if you will, in terms of susceptibility to this ransomware, right? And you can tie those off to practices. I pointed out the Cyber Essentials, the NIST Cyber Essentials, excuse me, not NIST, the CISA Cyber Essentials, excuse me, they were before. They do a really good job at providing you capabilities that can be tied off in tiers to what it means to be resistant, or maybe you're highly susceptible and that you're not adhering enough to those practices. So from there, we also talked a lot about, okay, so we have this assessment together. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to pilot it? Now, I have some thoughts here that may not be, I don't know, like considered, well, I don't know, let's say I'm radical. I don't know, I'm not too radical. But here's my initial thought. You want to actually create a base of assessed customers that are very diverse across a lot of different sectors. So when we built this ransomware assessment, this validated ransomware readiness assessment with CISA, we wanted to think about different organizations that we could look at. So we looked at organizations within the U.S. Federal government, civilian federal government. We looked at municipal organizations. We looked at industry players, critical infrastructure players. So we tried to use the assessment across a broad set of folks so that we could understand if it was effective or not. And we did have some lessons learned from that. One is it's very organizationally dependent on establishing those scope boundaries. As I talked before, scope was incredibly challenging to negotiate with the customer set and get them to gain a degree of comfort and coming to the table and sharing their deepest, darkest. I'll give you an example there, actually, a real tangible one that you can walk away with. And this is actually something to consider too in terms of logistics, where you start talking to an organization and saying, hey, provide me all your enterprise risk program policies. Give me all your policies related to cybersecurity and your control stack. Provide me all information related to the kind of exercises in your organization. How about asset management policies and maybe even a direct sample of your organizational practices. And some organizations were not comfortable sharing all that information, which places the burden on the facilitator, on the assessor. When they come into the organization, actually start doing technical exchange, the face-to-face, there's a lot more that needs to be asked because there's a lot more that's unknown coming in the organization. So getting an upfront read ahead on a lot of that information as it's in the organization is very helpful, but it can be challenging to get. So there has to be this trust building exercise, if you will, between the organizations. This may come down to having a standard set of terms and conditions that you can share with them to say, hey, here's how we treat your information. Here's what we're going to do with it. Once we're done with the information, we're going to get rid of it. It may be a PCI consideration, something to that effect. That you're going to work with the organization to give them that level and degree of trust that you can work well with their information and give them a fair assessment. Let's see. We also know from running a lot of these assessments that organizations have their own organizational or operational tempo. So as they're in the heat of holiday sales, if they're a retail organization, or if they're in the summer months, maybe some organizations tend to slow down because they have a lot of people who are on vacation. So they're not going to have those subject matter experts available. It makes things challenging. So you have to be very flexible here in terms of, and this is once again somewhat a logistics issue of when are you going to actually execute this assessment? That phase of actually being there and doing this technical exchange. You may have to accommodate that operational tempo. You may have to come back more than 1 to 2 days because people just aren't available. So you have to prepare for that and think about it in terms of resource expenditure. So a big thing here, and actually I jumped around a little bit. I should have maybe moved this bullet up, but it's still important to note. As you're ingesting this information from an organization, you want to consider what's demonstrable evidence that organizations are delivering upon what they commit to. It's one thing to have a policy and to tell people to go do great things. It's even better to have a procedure to tell them how to do those great things. It's yet another for them to provide you the evidence to say, hey, look how we did this risk assessment. And by the way, we're doing it in a standardized manner across the organization. So what does that look like? What is their tool? What kind of evidence can they show you? This may help to partner with audit entities, like if the organization has their own internal audit teams, or maybe they have characters in an organization who are serving as auditors for their organization or independent reviewers. Maybe a good time to talk to them and find out, what is the evidence that they're relying upon to get a fair assessment of their organization. Let's see. Oh, one last thing. That documentation you may get, just because you get it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to provide you all your answers. Okay, so as you're getting these policies, you're getting these procedures, they may in fact have gaps. They may have things that are lacking, and you're going to have to provide additional focus or additional questions to get that fair understanding of what risks or what uncertainty may exist in the organization there. And by the way, as you're finding that out, as you're finding out that those policies maybe are not adequate, it's going to add to once again to the burden of the facilitator to figure out what kind of questions to ask and how to get an effective analytic assessment of what's going on there. Okay, so some takeaways to leave with, right? One is we clearly want to have priorities set in terms of what we want to accomplish here, right? And if you go into an organization and you say, hey, we're going to help you understand what controls that you're going to need, we're going to help you rank and prioritize the risks you have. As an assessor, you have to have like this fair understanding that not everything can be read. If everything is read, then nothing is really read, right? So make sure that your scoring model delivers you enough variegation, enough breakout, if you will, of these risks so that you can provide them with a fair understanding of, what is most important, what is maybe for tomorrow or next month, and what is for the distant future that we can break out and make more important decisions in terms of what we want to provide. And that goes back to the idea too, that when you identify these risks, not all these threats or not all these vulnerabilities that you identify, not all of them are equal in terms of the value they're delivering the organization and how if it's a vulnerability or a threat, how they can bring impact to these assets within the organization, right? So you want to come in and figure out how these organizations are quantifying the value of delivery. Is it in terms of dollars? Is it in terms of product out the door, service delivered? Maybe it's the amount of service time of delivery, that kind of a thing. So you can get hint of that, by the way, in the risk appetite statement at times. So there's a thought to be had there to understand, like, once again, how do they feel pain? How do they even quantify it? Clearly, most people are going to be focused on, well, okay, so I need a lot of controls. I can't buy everything off the shelf here. You got to help me out. So what are going to be the most effective controls to help me conserve resources? This is art more in science at times, can be a science in some cases. But if you think about it, like from layman's terms, in a sense, like help them understand that you're going to pick controls, or you're going to suggest controls that they will have that can cover multiple risks at a time, right? Look for controls that are common. Look at ones that will reduce risk exposure across multiple risks. Those are always very helpful to have, right? So there may be a consideration too, like a second tier of consideration after you have the effect part. The expense part is going to quickly become another discussion. So just something to be mindful of there, okay? And once again, get back to that base blocking and tackling, right? Always think about like this defense in depth strategy. You're concerned about confidentiality, the integrity, the availability of the organization and its most critical data assets. Ransomware is no exception here. You want to keep people focused on how they're preserving that CIA in their organization. In that regard, as you're building out and you're delivering these kind of assessments, and especially if you're talking about ransomware, make sure you know your enemy and know your environment. Who are the threat actors who are looking to break into your networks? Do you have record, or do you have incidents that you have fair sense? Do you have good threat intelligence, that kind of thing? And know, more importantly, what assets you have in your organization. Asset management is key. Make sure you know what your high value assets are for consideration. Make sure you start with the biggies. Start with the easy stuff, right? Start with the biggest threat vectors that exist in terms of where you have phishing in your organization, where you've seen maybe emails that are coming in, maybe there are certain campaigns that your organization is very familiar with that they see quite often. Maybe you're running your own campaign just to test your workforce too, which is always helpful. Let's see, make sure that your security program accommodates and complements your overall strategy organization. In other words, don't spend $1 million fence around a stack of quarters, right? Don't spend $1 million on a fence to protect a stack of quarters. Whew. Oh, it's getting later in the afternoon, guys. So you see what I'm saying here. You want to understand that an organization has a limited amount of resources to apply. So you want to make sure that the controls that you're recommending that to be put in place, that they may be reasonable, or that there's a reasonable time element here to consider how these controls could be implemented. And at the end of the day, encourage organizations to roadmap their journey. Think about the controls they need today. Think about the controls they need in the next following months to years. So that way they know how to allocate their resources properly and select the right controls that they may have in mind. So tons of different ways to interface with us and engage. I'm always happy to talk. I'll leave my contact information up here at the end of the discussion. I really appreciate your time and your ear. Shane, any questions or anything that's popped up recently in the chat?
Yeah, but we had one earlier from Jacob asking if you could suggest some kind of tool for incident management.
Wow, can I suggest a specific tool for incident management?
Yeah.
To be honest with you, as an FFRDC, it's not our place to recommend tools. So I don't know that I can name a specific one, but how about we talk about the attributes of what we would look for in a specific tool? Let's go with that route, right? One is something that is easy to use, right? Complexity is the killer of good cybersecurity practice. And by the way, when you say tool, I'm thinking about like maybe it's the graphic user interface that you're talking about. You're thinking about like how is it actually reported? What are the alerts I'm getting? Things like that. I want that to be easily navigable. That's the first thing I want to have, right? I want it so that the workforce that I'm giving it to can easily and intuitively pick it up, understand it, and use it readily. Especially because, let's face it, when you have an incident response team, you're bringing a lot of, it's a high stress kind of a team. So you may have a lot of turnover and you don't want your policies, you don't want your practices to be so complex that it takes an immense amount of training to get people up and running. And also think about it too, in the heat of the moment, you don't want people fumbling through a tool to try to figure out how to make things work. You want it to be, in a sense, as automated as possible or as user-friendly as possible. So that way you can enact your policies with great effect, okay? So, sorry, not our place to recommend a specific tool, but I definitely know I want it to be easy.
No, very good answer. We actually have had a similar comment, someone else chiming in on that question with a similar response, just saying how the tools should be robust, have timely responses while integrating with your existing systems and processes. So similar answer, sounds good. Next one I had just from earlier, Brett, is like, are there particular industries or targets of ransomware? Like who's most susceptible to this?
Well, I think we've seen that nobody is immune. When you ask a question like that, classically, critical infrastructure, like sectors start coming up in my mind.
Right.
I think about energy. I think about transportation, things like that. And by the way, it has happened, right? We saw, for example, with Colonial Pipeline, where we had effectively the East Coast denied of fuel for a good period of time. So I think that clearly those players have their mind set to ransomware being a concern. But I know too that this is one of those threats that it tends to affect just about everybody, right? I mean, even if I had my own personal cell phone get locked down, I can only imagine the terror and panic in my heart that's going to take place, right? So I think that it goes without saying that all people should learn more and be more savvy to what a phishing email looks like, or what maybe a texting scam or things like that, just so that good cyber hygiene practice is exercised. Start early. Start with schools. Start with children. Work your way up all the way into industry. Make sure those critical infrastructure sectors, when they're hiring new employees, there's a crash course on day one on what the expectations are for use of their system. So that way, the cyber hygiene aspect is like proliferated throughout the entire organization. There should be no question of it. It should be almost as natural as going to find the lunchroom.
Right. So I'll put you on the hot seat here a little bit, Brett. I know you're trying to prevent ransomware attacks, but let's say someone is a target or someone does experience one. What type of questions should they be asking after that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'm going to assume that this question is post-event. During the event, clearly there are lots of questions like, what do we do now? I'm terrified. Who do we talk to?
Right.
Who do we work with? So there's all that kind of stuff. So that's the incident itself, right? Post-incident, though, and I like to think about it in terms of like lessons learned, right? So what was the vector? How did this attack get into the organization? A lot of times it's challenging for organizations to even know what assets were impacted. So getting to the bottom line of like, what was the assessment for the business impact itself? Like, clearly we lost availability for a time. So there's that initial impact of just not being able to deliver service. But what about the confidentiality and integrity that was violated for the information that this threat actor clearly had their hands on, right? How do I go back and understand that one, they're still not resident in the system. That's a big one. But to understand, like, maybe there are things that they have disrupted. Maybe there's critical information they changed, ones to zeros and zeros to ones, whatever the case may be, that may inhibit additional operation in the future and or the effect of my organization. Make no doubt of it. Like everything should be suspect until you can figure it out. So I'd be asking questions about that, the forensics of it, the how, what are lessons learned, what are new controls to be put in place, what are new configurations that we can bring to our security stack, given the threat picture that we know we're in now. All good questions to ask.
Great response. Thanks for that, Brett. One from Jamie asking, do you have any particular IT risk assessment or risk management educational resources that you would recommend? So I know that's a lot of your background. What ones could you?
Yeah. So how about I start with just, I'll be selfish. I'm going to use this as a selfish plug. My team itself, we have a number of risk management classes we provide. Whether you're looking to learn more about the resilience aspect of it, so you want to learn more about CERT resilience management model, which risk is very much a part of. I like to say that it's the risk chicken that lays a resilience egg. So if you're good at risk management, you'll have inherently good resilience in your organization. So you want to start there. Also, I offer classes on Octave Allegro, which is an assessment tool for risks for your frontline management teams, but also Octave Forte delivery of training. We also have workshops, by the way, for the implementation of these, where we talk about the enterprise aspects of it. So how do I take this cyber risk program and make it resonate so that way my executive team understands what risks are, and how do we communicate those across the organization, and how do we select controls globally across the organization? So Octave Forte is also helpful there. We have training on that. And then we can get more specific as well. If you want to learn how to measure, develop metrics for your organization in terms of risk, whatnot, we have Measuring What Matters, so you can learn about GQM. Now, to reach out, there are other resources as well, not just with CERT. And by the way, I'd recommend to see the CERT homepage. Maybe, Shane, you can provide that to folks so they can see what our training resources are. There's tons of great things. I don't even hardly know where to start with that one. There's always the fundamental blocking and tackling, right? That you can find out there. There's, you can look at ISACA, you can look at ISC Square. There's tons of great training programs that they have, and there's certifications offered with all that stuff as well. There's a lot of public resources available. Look at the CISA website. There's a lot of good information that you find up there. Law enforcement, you look at federal law enforcement organizations, InfraGard. If you're an InfraGard member, if you're not, see if you can jump in and work with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and learn more about the things that they're thinking about. Holy cow, I could get exhaustive with this. There's a lot. Also, look at local university resources. Carnegie Mellon. Look at go to whether school is local to your area and just find out what kind of programs they have. They may even have like executive level training programs like we have for our CISO program, but they may have more operator related training programs, not necessarily as a part of a degree, although that's also a possibility if you're looking for that extreme of an end state, that you could just get a couple courses in to learn more about it.
Next one, Brett, we had from Jiba asking, do you recommend the ransomware tabletop exercise? If you're familiar with that.
I'm not sure if there's a specific one that you're referring to. I do recommend running tabletop exercises. And yes, we have found that there is a gap that some organizations are not necessarily using ransomware as one of the exemplar scenarios to go through, right? I would argue at times there are some organizations that get comfortable with their, let's say, their set bucket or box of scenarios that they pull from every year. Time to do the tabletop again. Let's hurry up and get this over with, kind of a behavior, right? Now, I'm not saying this is everybody, by the way, but you'll see where there's a set library of scenarios, for example, and people are slow at times to evolve that library and make sure those scenarios are providing example of threats that are relevant. So take time to invest into the scenario development for your tabletop exercises. And I know that's hard to do because let's face it, a lot of organizations are busy. Most times tabletops are just kind of run just like seat of your pants just to get it done, to declare victory. But that's the time when people recognize and realize that they're players. They actually have to do things for these events, right? And you start identifying the fact that, hey, that person over there, their role is supposed to be responding. They didn't even know what they were supposed to do. They didn't know to log in. They didn't know to, call somebody up. They didn't know what were the bounds of our expectations. So that's another thing I want to point out, actually, Shane. I'm going to build on this idea. It's one thing to have a policy to say what to do. It's a whole other for a management team, for an executive team to have expectations of how events are going to go down, right? So a tabletop exercise is a good way to understand, hey, this is what's written in the policy, but here's what our management team is expecting in terms of recommendations and control selection and actions to take. So that's why tabletops are really good to have. They kind of bridge that gap that you may be missing in your policy space.
All right, Brett, let's get you out of here on this one. If someone wants more information on this assessment method you talked about today, can they reach out directly to you, or?
You can reach out to me and I'd be happy to put you in touch with our CISA counterpart too, so that they can look into this VRA assessment.
Great. Brett, thanks you for sharing this today. We appreciate your expertise.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good day.
And that concludes our webcast for today. We'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending. Upon exiting, please hit the like button below the video window and share the archive if you found value. You can also subscribe to the SEI YouTube channel by clicking on the SEI seal in the lower right corner of the video window. Lastly, join us for our next webcast, which will be October 27th. Our topic will be applying the principles of Agile to strengthen the federal cyber workforce. And that will be with Josh Hammerstein. Registration information is available on our website now and will be emailed out as well. Any questions from today's event, please send them to info@sei.cmu.edu. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.